Hi, in this section of video notes we're going to be talking about plant organs, specifically root stems and leaves. We're going to focus in this section on roots and leaves. Recall that an organ is a collection of different tissues working together for a common function, and plants have three major organs. This slide's in italics because it's not my intention you're writing it down now. We'll talk about each one individually. Essentially, roots absorb nutrients and anchor the plant, stems support the plant and transport water and nutrients, and leaves do photosynthesis. So let's focus more on roots. So sometimes roots are called the hidden half because there's a lot of roots, a lot more than most people realize. Almost as much as half of the plant's mass is underground. The function of the roots are multiple. The first one is to anchor the plant, help it stand upright, and help it withstand the forces that would cause it to tip over. Of course, probably the most obvious and probably also the most important is the roots absorbed water and minerals. So there's no food. A lot of people have the misconception that the roots absorb food from the soil. It's water and then mineral nutrients that the plants need. Roots also store extra sugars. And finally, after they absorb the nutrients and absorb the water, they need to be able to transport that to higher up in the plant. Let's take a quick second and review the functions of roots. When we look at the anatomy of a root, there's a couple of important pieces to consider. The first part is that the root basically looks like this, where there's an epidermis on the outside, cortex in the middle, and vascular tissue in the very most middle. The arrangement of the vascular tissue is different in monocots and dicots, and so we can see in this picture that makes an X. In other types of plants, the vascular bundles are more scattered. So let's talk about the root epidermis first. The epidermis is the outermost layer. Our epidermis is our skin. It's also our outermost layer. It's a single layer of cells, and its job is multiple. It protects the plant from diseases. It absorbs water and nutrients in the root. And to aid it, it has root hairs. So this is a root seedling, and here's the root coming out, and these little fuzzes are root hairs. They serve to increase the surface area of the root so that there can be more area for water absorption. We also have lateral roots, or sometimes branch roots. Those should not be confused with root hairs. So root hairs are usually very, very tiny, microscopic, and you can sometimes feel them as kind of fuzzy. Branch roots are just what the name sounds, branches of the roots, and so they're different than the root hairs. Let's take a moment and review the root epidermis. Let's talk quickly about ground tissue in the root, which we often refer to as the cortex. The ground tissue serves really two functions. First, it provides substance to help support it. Imagine trying to hold up a giant pole with a thin piece of string. It wouldn't be any good. You need to have some hefty supports to do that, and so ground tissue provides some of that bulk. Also, ground tissue helps store nutrients. So you probably have had yams or sweet potatoes or regular potatoes or carrots. Those are all high in carbohydrates because they store some of the food for the plant. Once again, the cortex is the space between the vascular bundle and the epidermis. Part of the root's ground tissue includes the endodermis. The endodermis is the innermost layer of cortex right on the edge of the vascular bundle, and in this picture it's the pink layer. Within the endodermis is the Casparian strip. The function is to help control nutrient uptake. So osmosis of water requires water to go from where there's high concentration to where there's a lower concentration. The problem with that is in the root, the goal is to basically push water into the vascular system so it can climb the plant. That means that they're putting a lot of water into their roots, and there would be a tendency for that water to seep out into the cortex where there's less water. And so the Casparian strip is a waxy layer. It's water impermeable, so water is pumped into the vascular tissue, and then the Casparian strip kind of prevents it from seeping back out. As we look at the root, we have our exodermis, that single layer of cells, where we would find our root hairs. This picture doesn't really have many. It's got a couple that we can sort of see forming, but usually they're a little bit easier to see. We also have the cortex, the vascular bundle, where the xylem and phloem are, and then the endodermis that separates the two. Let's take a minute and review the cortex of the root. Another component of the root we should discuss is the tip of the root. So at the tip of the root, we have what we call the apical meristem. Remember that meristematic tissue is in charge of growth. So meristems usually have undifferentiated cells that can undergo mitosis. That typically is found right at the tip. But a little bit past that is a layer of dead cells, and those dead cells are called the root cap. They help protect the root as it forges its way through the rough soil. We also see forming some lateral roots, and as I mentioned, those lateral roots are not to be confused with root hairs. They form basically branches of new roots. I don't want to focus too much on how the root grows, but the main idea is that the cells divide first, then they get bigger, and then they differentiate it into different specialized parts. So as we were looking to see mitosis, we would look at the very bottom because all of the cells would look very similar, and there'd be lots of cells undergoing division. Looking further up, we'd see bigger cells, and even higher, we'd see differentiation occur. Let's quickly review root growth. Finally, let's compare the two different kinds of roots we see in angiosperms. So in angiosperms, we have taproots. Taproot would be like a carrot, where there's one very big root that would go down and stay fairly thick, and the secondary roots would be fairly minimal. We would find that in hickory and oak and carrots. In a fibrous root, you're probably more used to seeing that with grass. You pull up a hunk of grass and you've got a whole bunch of thin fibers that are branched and networked, and all the pieces are basically the same size. We would see again in grasses and some of the trees. Let's switch our attention now to leaves. Leaves have a most important part of doing photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is, of course, how plants capture energy. So they convert carbon dioxide from the air to sugars, and as a result, as a waste product, not the goal, a lot of people get confused, but as a waste product, they produce oxygen. The leaves also do transpiration. Transpiration is basically the evaporation of water, and And it's because water is evaporating from the leaves and the pressure of the water in the roots is so strong that the water actually climbs the plant. We'll talk more when we talk about about plant physiology. So you know what leaves look like. We have three main parts, general structure parts to refer to. The first one, the flat part, is the blade. And then the stalk, or the little leaf stem, is called the petiole. And finally, of course, the veins are the lines that run throughout it. When we classify plants, a lot of times we classify them based on what the blade of the leaf looks like, whether it has like little teeth like this one does here on the edges, whether it's lobed, and how the vein pattern is. Let's take a minute and review general leaf information. When we talk about the leaf anatomy, as usual, we have dermal tissue, ground tissue, and vascular tissue. In the case of leaf, we see dermal tissue on the top and the bottom, ground tissue in the middle, and vascular tissue in the most middle. Okay. Everything about the leaf structure is about maximizing photosynthesis and transpiration. So here we see a microscope image of a leaf. We have our upper epidermis on the top, lower epidermis. We have some pores for transpiration. We have cells in the top that do photosynthesis and cells in the bottom that do gas exchange. So let's start with the dermal tissue. You've learned about a lot of the dermal tissue of a leaf already. So the epidermis, once again, is the outer layer. And as I mentioned, everything about the leaf is about facilitating photosynthesis and transpiration. So if you're going to be an outer layer of something that needs to absorb sunlight, you better be able to transmit sunlight through you. So the epidermis is transparent so the light can pass. Some epidermal tissue has trichomes. Remember, trichomes are the little fuzzes that help plants retain water and defend against predators. Some epidermis also has a cuticle, which is the waxy layer that makes some leaves shiny and prevents evaporation. And then most have a lower epidermis, well, all have a lower epidermis, and on that lower epidermis you'll find a high incidence of stomata with guard cells. So stomata is the hole, and the cells that open and close around it based on the water content are the guard cells. Leaf vascular tissue is mostly in the veins, and as usual it's made up of xylem and phloem. Typically the xylem is on the top and the phloem is on the bottom. There's usually a sheath around it to hold it together and to help support the leaf. Leaf ground tissue is highly specialized to facilitate photosynthesis and transpiration. So collectively the ground tissue is called mesophyll, and it's divided really into two main areas. Palisade parenchyma, or in other words sometimes called palisade mesophyll, is the stuff on the top. So it's these long and skinny cells, and the point of the long and skinny cells is that every cell essentially has some real estate on the top where the sunlight would hit. And as the plant does photosynthesis, the chloroplasts cycle through like this, so they can all catch a little sunlight on the top, do the rest of the process of photosynthesis, and come around and collect some more sunlight. So every cell has some access that way, and they can cram a lot of cells that can do photosynthesis in that top layer. The bottom layer is called spongy parenchyma, or spongy mesophyll, and if you notice it's much more rounded cells with air spaces between them, and that's so that gas exchange can go out of the bottom cells of the stomata. Carbon dioxide can come in, and oxygen can go out. If they were packed in tightly, like the palisade, air would not be able to move quite as freely. This is a really cartoonized version of it, but it shows the structure really, really well. Packed in cells up top that each have layers, each have access to sunlight on the top and oxygen and carbon dioxide on the bottom. A vein surrounded by a sheath with xylem on the top, phloem on the bottom, and gas exchange in the spongy mesophyll on the bottom. Let's review one last time, this time on leaf ground tissue. That's it for this note session. As always, come see me if you have any questions.